Thank you. Thank you so much. So welcome again, everyone. I'm Diane Corman-Levy, the Chief Disruptor at Women's Way, and I'm delighted that you've decided to spend the next 90 minutes with us. When we refer to women, we mean trans and cis women, femme-identified people, which includes anyone who is not trans or cis woman, but who identifies as feminine, and also those who identify as gender expansive, non-binary, and or gender non-conforming. While we wait for folks to sign on, I think most of you have, I would appreciate you taking the poll. We want to know if this is the first time attending a Women's Way event. So if you could just spend a few seconds answering the poll, that would be great.
Diane?
Yes.
Just an ask to slow down a little bit from the interpreter.
Thank you. Sorry. So if you could complete the poll that's on the screen, that would be, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Today's forum is part of a year-long series whose purpose is to educate different stakeholders about the drivers of the gender wealth gap and action steps each of us can take to help close the gender wealth gap. Since October 2020, we have conducted 21 forums that address different drivers of the gender wealth gap, such as strengthening the early childhood education sector, gender and racial disparities in healthcare, increasing access to affordable housing, promoting equity in grant making, and building worker power. Today's session explores community wealth building as a framework for transforming policy, practice, and systems to create local economies that are just and ensure well-being for all. We will explore current models that exist for building collective assets, community ownership, and positioning citizens and neighbors as key decision makers. You will hear from three amazing panelists who will address the issue from practitioner, advocacy, and policy perspectives. You will also have opportunities to ask questions to the speakers via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. Closed captioning is enabled. If you do not want to see closed captioning, you can click Hide CC at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also enabled, so please share your comments during the session to create a safer space for all of us to engage in honest and challenging discussions. We ask each of you to abide to the session norms listed in the chat box. Finally, we will record the session and make it available for you to view again, and for those who could not attend today. After the session, we will also send you a list of resources related to today's topic and a survey to evaluate the session. We deeply value your input as we work to continually improve these educational forums. Before we introduce you to the panelists and moderator, I first want to thank, get this going, Aathira for their partnership in providing interpretation support for tonight's session. I also want to thank our session sponsors listed on the slide for their generous support. So for the next few minutes, Kelly Sheard, Director of the Gender Wealth Institute, and I are going to spend the next few minutes providing an overview of the economic state of women and children, why Women's Way is investing its resources into addressing the gender wealth gap, and how today's topic is related to the gender wealth gap. So for those who don't know about Women's Way, we were formed in the mid-1970s. We hold a unique place in the nation's history as the first umbrella funding federation in the United States that was specifically dedicated to issues such as wage equity, rape crisis, domestic violence, reproductive freedom, and post-incarceration reentry. I'm going to spend a little bit talking about, well, let me just talk about our mission. We are a for gender and racial justice organization whose mission is to achieve gender and racial equity by building collective power to disrupt systems of oppression and strengthen alternative models centered in love, liberation, and inclusion. Just a little bit of information about the economic state of women, which is not great. Pre-COVID, and it hasn't really improved much, 80% of workers in the United States were living paycheck to paycheck. Majority are women. Philadelphia, unfortunately, still has the highest poverty rate. It's probably gone down a little bit, but below 25%, but it's still the highest poverty rate among the 10 largest cities. And the region's largest demographic group living in poverty are women ages 25 to 34. Related to this is the gender wealth gap, which I'll talk a little bit more about, which is larger than the pay equity gap, and it's worsening. Related to the gender wealth gap is the retirement gap, where 80% of women are likely to be living in poverty by age 65. If these current trends continue, gender parity will not be achieved until at least 2133. So what is the gender wealth gap? And this shows a comparison of Black women, non-Hispanic women, Black women to non-Hispanic white men. Single white women own 56 cents on the dollar compared to single white men. Hispanic women own 10 cents, and non-Hispanic Black women own 5 cents. And this has not improved. In fact, it's worsened. If you look at the economic pyramid, what this shows is how wealth is distributed across our country. The top 1% of the population holds 47% of the nation's wealth, while 80% of the population holds only 9% of the nation's wealth. And the 80% include many of them are women and women of color, working class, and during the pandemic, these were the essential workers. So how has the wealth gap grown recently? These are some data points which I find very disturbing. During the past 2 years, the wealth of the world's 10 richest men doubled, while the incomes of 99% of humanity fell. The wealthiest 10 people now own more wealth than 40% of all humanity. And since 2009, when we hear about income gains, 95% of income gains in the United States have gone to the top 1%, while 47% of Americans cannot put together even $400 in the face of an emergency. Disturbing, and also not sustainable. So to close the gender wealth gap, we need to answer the questions. Why do we have an economic system where 1% of the population holds 47% of the nation's wealth, and the majority of those at the top are white Christian heterosexual men, and the bottom 80% holds 9% of the nation's wealth, many of whom are women of color? So we need to know and answer the question, how did we get here? And how does our current economic system normalize and institutionalize greed? Did I see a hand up? No? Okay. So to answer these questions, we also need to understand how wealth and power were built in America and how they currently operate. And I have a statement here that says wealth comes from the extraction of others. So the expanding pools of great wealth, which we showed at the top 1%, are created by financial extraction, such as the growing crisis of families trapped in predatory lending and unsustainable debt, the stifling of small and medium-sized businesses that create jobs, and dark money's attack on democracy. Capital bias is the bias towards the maximum increase of capital, maximum benefit to wealth holders that operates inside the processes and institutions through which capital deploys functional power. It's the idea that capital is the money that must limitlessly grow, and it operates primarily through the mechanisms of profit extraction. A lot there. So for us at Women's Way, we need to create a new normal, a new bold vision for our economy that really provides solutions to centuries of systemic exclusion, extraction, and exploitation, which just doesn't just undermine those who are being exploited, it really undermines our economic potential in the United States. So we created something called the Gender Wealth Institute, whose vision is to close the gender wealth gap in our region by advancing research and practical solutions that build wealth for women who are economically insecure. And I'm going to do one more slide and then pass it on to Kelly Sheard. So when we talk about wealth at Women's Way, we use a definition pioneered by our friends at the Maven Collaborative. And I just want to read it because I think it's much more comprehensive than wealth as defined by capitalism. We live and retire with greater dignity, freedom, and peace of mind. Wealth is when our communities are prosperous, resilient, and vibrant. When future generations have the freedom to dream big and become all they truly can be. And when we are healthy and know that our family, networks, and communities are healthy, spiritually whole, and contributing. I'm now going to pass it on to Kelly Sheard, the director of the Gender Wealth Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And thank you for starting with our definition of wealth. It's important to start here because we want to move the conversation beyond individual economic stability and possession of financial assets. Both of those concepts are important, but they're often not enough to encompass the lived experience of abundance that we seek to build. We also want to start by stating our theoretical framework for how race and gender interplay in the expression of power, as well as how our current economic system functions. Consider these points our key concepts. First, a brief primer on racialized capitalism. We understand capitalism to be the private ownership of property where one class of people control and profit from the labor of the subordinate class. The social structure of capitalism reflects a system of relationships, domination amongst categories of people. The subordinate class is necessarily racialized and the dominant class is white. As it relates to capitalism, whiteness is institutional, collective, and cumulative, and has little to do with individual experiences. It is a structural advantage that confers dominance and causes racialized outsiders to compete to seek the rewards and privileges of whiteness. Next slide. Next slide. Wealth supremacy helps us understand why we exist in an economic system that believes wealthy people matter more than others. This concept refers to cultural and political processes and attitudes by which the wealthy accumulate and maintain prestige, power, and privilege, as well as how wealth is protected and grown by the privileged class. It's about the myths of extraction and exploitation that drive hoarding, as well as the system design that reflects the valuation and protection of that extreme hoarding. Next slide. Finally, heteropatriarchy is a logic that justifies the subordination of all those who are not heterosexual cisgender men. The civilizing projects of a gender binary, along with the construction of heterosexuality as normative, serve the interests of the dominant. Anything outside of the constructed norm is seen as deviant and unworthy, and therefore oppression becomes justified. There's an ethos of meritocracy in a system designed to protect the interests of the dominant. These are brief primers on three concepts we feel are important. Of course, this does not encompass every idea worth mentioning, but instead offers a framework to understand how we get to dangerous outcomes like the gender wealth gap. Next slide. When talking about the gender wealth gap, we are typically talking about the concentration and distribution of assets. That is, a few people with a disproportionate amount and thus an outsized amount of power. In the context of capitalism, this is maybe a natural outcome of the model. A criticism of capitalism is that property rights are more important than the needs of individuals or communities. We might think about how community wealth building speaks to or diverges away from the framework of capitalism. How is community wealth building different? Community wealth building can be seen as a response to what the Democracy Collaborative frames as capitalism in crisis. They note increasing severity of economic system shocks like depressions and recessions, planetary boundaries at the brink, and additional challenges. Democracy Collaborative leader Marjorie Kelly also reminds us that community wealth building has service to the public good at its core rather than profit maximization. Next slide. This slide contains some examples of community wealth building models, which we encourage everyone to look into. We can understand these examples of community wealth building as a way to shift power. Author and strategist Rebecca Subar offers us a definition of power that moves beyond simply control. Power can also be understood as the ability of a group to meet a specific objective or the ability to produce an intended effect. It's also about the ability to create and the ability to change things and more. These examples show us that ownership is more than financial return. It's also about community members having a say in how the neighborhood develops. It can be a way to help residents prosper in place, mitigating their need to uproot. We know communities of color have less wealth individually. There are also historically under-resourced areas where new development often threatens to displace long-term residents. These models and the broader framework offer us a way to think about and actualize collective well-being. Next slide. Some of the benefits of community wealth building are listed here, but this is not an exhaustive list. The Democracy Collaborative mentions shared economic prosperity along with racial equity and ecological sustainability. Because community wealth building is a full systems approach, it requires alternative institutions, approaches, and relationships at various scales. The potential and possibility of community wealth building exist at various levels. Next slide. These slides are dense, but offer a way to think about different broad approaches to community wealth building. Labor, land, and capital are pillars to community wealth building. All of these frameworks provide models of economic inclusion where community members participate in the development of the local economy. There are many ways to shift ownership and wealth building to community members. First, neighborhood crowdfunding, a way to have fractional ownership or a small stake in an income-producing business or property. It also allows for investment from non-accredited investors, that is, community members with lower incomes and lower net worth. In this framework, they have less barriers to invest. In some models, they can even enjoy more favorable terms as local shareholders. For occupant equity, community land trusts are a sample model for the occupant equity framework. Community land trusts own the land while residents and/or local businesses own improvements on the land, like the structures themselves or the businesses operated on the land. Residents are often involved in the governance and can also work to pool resources to obtain land and develop it according to community needs. Next slide. Local institutional equity frameworks can provide a way for institutions to redirect revenue and investment toward community priorities. Projects under neighborhood nonprofit trust are intended to help residents benefit directly from development happening in their neighborhoods. It's important to note that projects can use multiple frameworks simultaneously, and this only represents one way of organizing community wealth building models. Next slide. Community wealth building models can be a way to build individual wealth and also address the issue of historically under-resourced areas. With promising design features such as low purchase prices, easy exits for residents, ongoing buy-in options, and more, it can be a way to counter what the Democracy Collaborative calls centralized and top-down approaches to reducing poverty that are often insufficient. To make these frameworks viable and these models sustainable, we need scale and interlinked systems coordination. From our panelists today, we will hear more about what's needed to make this alternative economic framework replicable and successful for our communities, as well as what's worked already for residents. Our hope is to provide an introduction into community wealth building to stimulate solutions-oriented thinking. Next slide. As always, part of the work of liberation is to uncover the plot, that is, the intentions, actions, and outcomes. Next slide. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, Aathira Chennat, GWI Program and Data Manager. Aathira?
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm so excited to hop into this panel. We've just gone over a lot of really complex principles and concepts, and I think we have an amazing panel to kind of help put all of that into context and see how it happens in practice, especially in Philly. So I want to give the floor to the panelists and have them introduce themselves. So I would love for each of you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your work and what perspective you're bringing today in this conversation around community wealth building. Nora, would you like to go first?
Sure. And in order to talk about why I'm here or how I got here, I wanted to show some slides, and I'm afraid I'm going to do this really fast, so you can tell me to slow down, especially for translation. So I'm here for two reasons. The first one is that 38 years ago, I was part of a group of women, and all of us either live, work, or worship in a section of North Philly in a neighborhood that came together to start a small business that would benefit women and our families. It was a community where a lot of the jobs had left because factories were closing down, and it included poorest census tracts in the state. We started raising funds to buy homes to rehab and vacant land to build new rental homes on. And I'm making it sound like it was easy, but it was really hard because no one who financed real estate development in the late 80s and early 90s believed that a group of women could do what we were doing. So we did this work for a while, and then all of a sudden, fast forward 2005, it seemed like our community that had been called the Badlands by the press was now a place where folks were turning abandoned factories, jobs lost, factories closing, into high-end condos and trying to turn vacant lots into fancy restaurants and stores. I'm going to give you some data, kind of in a quiz, but I don't think you can answer the quiz. The first is since 2000, the cost to buy a house in our neighborhood in North Philly went up 150%. True or false? The answer is false. It went up more than 350%. The second question is, if you work full-time in a minimum wage job, $7.25 an hour, you make about $15,000 a year, you could afford $600 a month in rent. That's not true. You can almost afford $380 a month in rent. And my last question is, citywide, half of all renters and a third of all homeowners pay more than they can afford for housing, true or false? And this, in fact, is true. 1 out of every 2 renters, 1 out of every 3 homeowners, once they pay for their
Hey, Nora,
homes.
just slow it down a little bit. Thank you.
Yep. Once they pay for their housing costs, there's not enough left over to pay for all the other necessities, their kids' sneaks, heat, transportation. This is the neighborhood where we started our organization. So you see on the right is a map of Philadelphia. That orange square was our neighborhood. And all of us in this neighborhood knew that there was a lot of blight and vacancy. And it wasn't until we got together with pencils and maps that we mapped all the vacant lots and buildings. Everything that's gray or black is either a vacant lot or a vacant building. And what we found out was 1 out of every 4 pieces of land was vacant. And of that vacancy, 1 out of every 4 vacant lots was owned by us, by the government. It was publicly owned by the city. In addition to a lot of vacancy, what you see is that the prices were going up and up and up. So you see the piazza to the south of us in Northern Liberties, Temple student housing to the west of us in Temple Land, and Fishtown to the east. This is another example of that. And there's a map of our neighborhood is the red lines. And to the left, you see what properties sold for in 2001, 2002. Everything that is navy blue sold for $40,000 or less. And the map to the right, it's 6 years later, almost no navy blue. And you can see that properties on the edge of our neighborhood were selling for more than $200,000. So we started talking to folks in our community about neighborhood change, about vacant land, but we also talked about a tool that was mentioned in the introduction about community land trust to try to get a sense if people were interested. And this is how we talked about community land trusts. We know that there was a lot of vacant land and a lot of it was publicly owned by our city. If that could be transferred to a community organization and folks who wanted to could put it back to use to grow food, to create jobs, affordable housing, but the land would continue to be owned and it would be leased to groups, so it would maintain affordability. Go back to the neighborhood, report on our findings, and talk a lot about community land trusts. And it was at a meeting where we brainstormed, folks put their name tags up on a continuum. A land trust is a great idea. A land trust isn't a good idea. And it was at this meeting, everyone voted for the land trust. This is just names of other land trusts. And so we created our land trust. The second reason I'm here, and I just have a minute on this, is that in addition to having a community land trust, we also work together with other organizations to fight to make sure our city looks clearly at what you're calling the gender wealth gap and take steps to close the gap. And our organization is part of a coalition that works to get legislation passed that'll require elected officials to do the right thing and to address our city's affordable housing crisis. So if you're interested in learning more, That's me. You can check, you can contact me, and there'll be information that's sent out after the meeting about our work. But you may be part of a group that would like to join this coalition or just learn more about it.
So much, Nora. I'll pass it over to Adriana.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Adriana Abizadeh. I am the Executive Director of the Kensington Corridor Trust. We are a neighborhood trust based in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. And what we do is we purchase real estate on Kensington Avenue, which is one of the primary commercial corridors in the neighborhood. And we put it into a trust for the neighborhood to directly own, govern, and control the real estate. And our work is really deeply rooted in collective wealth building and community wealth building. And it was so beautiful just to hear some of the introduction into this space this afternoon, really thinking about how we counter traditional forms of wealth building because they are so individualized. It is so much about I and me. And our work at the Neighborhood Trust is really about us and we, and thinking about how we advance that together, right? And I just want to echo so much of what Nora mentioned and really remind us all that policy is how we got here, right? None of this is by mistake. All of this is by design. And so when we think about the gender wealth gap, or when we think about racial wealth gaps, these were policies that as a nation were implemented by predominantly white men to, for lack of a better way to say it, hold, suppress, ensure that the folks who look like me, right, other Black and brown women, women at large, other marginalized communities, did not have access to things like voting, things like having an independent bank account, like being able to own land and put your name on a deed or a title to a property, access to a driver's license, right? There are so many different things and so many different ways in which policy was built to ensure and to cause intentional harm. And so I just want to remind us as we go through today's conversation that if we are not working on systems, if we are not working on policy advocacy, if we are not at the table with legislators, if we're not meeting with city council, we're doing Band-Aid work, right? And Band-Aid work is important, right? That's not a knock. It is just a reality that they have to be in tandem. You have to do the work of ensuring that people are okay today, but you really have to do the work of ensuring that people are okay tomorrow. And that requires coalition, that requires collective work. And so that's what the Kensington Corridor Trust is about. We are about the collective wealth building, but we're also about the power and really ensuring that we're at the right tables and that our voices are being heard to move and change the systems that were built intentionally to hold us back. Thanks. Lisa, I think it's you.
It is me. I have to figure out how to unmute my mic. Thanks so much for this invitation and also just listening to Nora and Adriana tell their stories. I want to say that my role here is really in partnership to this work around community wealth building, and I'm the founder and managing partner of Community Impact Investments. And we were really born out of frustration. We are a set of practitioners who have all at some point in our careers worked to scale solutions, specifically solutions that address economic mobility, and we're unable to access the right type of capital to do our work. The capital we were raising, I think many of you are probably pretty familiar with this pattern. It was inflexible, it was impatient. It lacks stamina for sort of long-term strategies. And so we also felt that, and we're watching post the public death of George Floyd, money getting rushed out the door to address problems in communities and really sort of sitting at the national level with national initiatives and national players, which was absolutely necessary, but you can't build up a sustainable strategy at just the national level. And so we started to talk about how do we support local solutions and solution leaders who are getting overlooked as we are trying to build a movement around this work. and really begin to bring into communities the capital that will help scale solutions that address economic mobility and have a pathway to shifting policy and practice. I think this point that both Nora and Adriana make about systems approaches and really just taking hold of the power that's necessary to move political systems and structures is really what we're interested, are the types of solutions we're very interested in. And so it's not a surprise that we invested in the Women's Community Revitalization Project's Land Acquisition Loan Fund, and I'm hoping we'll talk more about that later. And as they were working to scale that loan fund, and in the Kensington Corridor Trust, neighborhood trust or community trust model. And so we also see our role as bringing a sense of urgency to these problems. I think that I've never been a funder in my life, and so it's sort of weird for when people sort of call me that now, but I think we see ourselves as partners and not necessarily as funders. And in that way, our job is to organize capital, the right types of capital around these solutions. And so we don't come with a particular kind of stack of or types of money that we think folks should use. We say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And let's figure out what the quote unquote capital stack and the types of funding that will advance the work and support you getting to moving it to scale. And so in that way, we're very much focused on a sort of a people-centered design approach. The other thing I'll mention is that it's sort of not a miracle that we started working with WCRP, and actually they were our first investment. WCRP was involved in our planning phase, and we felt it was really important. We had about 5 or 6 solution leaders who were involved in that phase. As we moved to further developing the fund, we offered the folks, the solution leaders who were involved in helping us design it, the opportunity to be part of the inaugural cohort and inaugural portfolio. And so once we leaned in to WCRP and these issues around land policy, around ownership, and land acquisition, it wasn't a big leap or jump to get to KCT and say, like there's a kinship across these ideas. And we want to not just learn more about this work, but we want to invest in it in a variety of ways that it needs investment. And when we say the word investment, we mean it in its broadest sense. So we provide coaching and we provide capital to help folks really build their solution for scale. So you may be able or have been doing your thing for 1,000 people, but you really want to figure out how do you take more of a systemic or community-wide approach to it. And so we have our resources are designed, and coaching is designed to help folks build financial and business models and develop communications tools that help them shift to thinking about how they scale their work. And so this provides sort of a sanctuary for folks to really begin to think more deeply about some of these questions that we're actually raising here today. And I think the other piece I'll mention, and I'll stop here, is that we believe that all this capital needs to be in service of community and in service of these ideas. And so when we invest, that means that we are working in service of our portfolio. Like we are working to find other folks to jump on. We are working to find other types of resources, non-financial and non-financial, that people can access. And so I think, so my role here is to really talk about sort of what's some of the structural things that need to be in place. That includes money. You cannot do this work without money. And in fact, it's the money that gives these leaders the power, not in their communities, but when they sit at the table with the other players. And so I'm just going to pause there. And I guess now we're moving to questions.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm loving hearing you all talk and understanding kind of the connections that brings your work together. And so I think we want to take a second to we've been talking a lot about how this is coalition work, community-based work, person-centered work. So it's all about who the people are that you're working with, who the people are in your community. So in that vein, the panelists and Women's Way work together to come up with a couple questions to turn around and ask the room, to kind of get a sense of what your experiences are with community wealth building, your familiarity. So I have some polls. Adriana, I don't know if you want to kind of like lead us through them, and I can kind of
Happy
launch
to.
them. Okay, great. So I'm gonna launch the first one. Yeah.
Okay, hi all. Again, Adriana here, Kensington Corridor Trust. So as we were thinking about this work, my beautiful colleague Nora always wants to create opportunities for engagement, right? It's not just a room where you're being talked at. And so doing stuff in person with her is very beautiful. This is our modified version of doing it online. And so we realized you might be coming from very different backgrounds, and we just wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. So if you could just answer what sector your work is in. And the translations are there line by line, side by side. And you will advance the poll question, Aathira?
Yes. So just a note from the interpreters to continue to remember to keep going a little bit slower. I think we've been upping the pace a little, but this is I'll share the results so everyone can see.
Awesome. So we have quite a diverse set of sectors represented. No co-op folks in the room today. That's okay. We love those folks. We'll catch up with them in other rooms. Could you please, yes, advance to the next one? And we'll try to move a little bit more quickly between the questions. So this one is just because Nora and I, this is our daily work. And Lisa is one of our strongest supporters, and just wanting to know, do you have experience with this work? With co-ops or community land trusts, neighborhood trusts, or other types of trusts, of which there are many. Amazing. So we have some folks who are here to learn, and we have some folks who have some experience. That's beautiful.
It's not letting me launch this next one.
That's okay. I think if we want to just move into the Q&A, so I'm acknowledging that time is ticking
Yeah.
by quickly.
That sounds good. Okay, so I see there's some questions in the chat. I will make sure that we address those in the Q&A. So just as a note, we will get to your questions. Thank you for adding them in the chat. So yeah, I'll dive into our questions here. So I think you all kind of addressed this first question a little bit, but I'm curious to hear how, in your opinion, how community wealth building models differ from our traditional economic models in practice, in your experience and work. Open the floor up to anyone who feels they want to jump in.
I'll jump. So I would say how it differs. I mean, I kind of got at this in the intro a little bit, but it really is an ideology of we, and that starts at the center of all work. Collective decision-making, collective ownership, collective wealth. It does require moving outside of the capitalistic mindset that so many of us normalize and are socialized to normalize, because that is the predominant wealth culture. And I think the community wealth building models, like the neighborhood trusts, really allow space for understanding. There's no rush, right? We're moving at the pace of trust. We want to make sure that everybody that's at the power table understands the decisions that are being made, the levers that they have access to, the policies that we're advocating for, so that we're not running through and then later going, wait, what did we decide? And did that really advance the collective? Was that in support of the collective? And so I think, if nothing else, these last 4 years of the Kensington Corridor Trust have really humbled me to take the time, because the market says run. The market says you have to move fast. Capital moves fast. Markets move fast. Real estate moves fast. And so we've had the ability and the opportunity to hold both. Both can be true. But we first have to lay the foundation for how we will make decisions. What are our priorities? What are the impact points we're trying to have? And I don't mean impact in the fancy philanthropic way. I mean in the truly tangible ways, right? Is it one more storefront that's open? Is it one more unhoused neighbor that gets transitioned to housing? What are the things that we really want to do and effectuate and change? And how do we make that happen? And once those baselines are there, you can move at the speed of capital and at the speed of the market, because you did the groundwork first. You took the time and the intention to build that collective decision-making framework for ultimate success, in my opinion.
I was going to add to that, I mean, the focus on impact makes it wildly different, right? And so basically what you're saying is impact first. And when you look at things from an impact first perspective, it's not that, some investors will care about whether or not they get some money back from an investment. But when you say it's impact first, that's what you're looking for. That's what you're communicating. The other piece for me, just working with Adriana and Nora, and from my own background, we have to figure out how to create these alternative structures that allow people who are well-meaning, they have money, but they're being told that there's only this vehicle over here that you can participate in, which is, requires them to get money back. So in the form of a loan or in form of debt, like you can do good over here and you're going to get, a return at X%. We have to create an alternative vehicle that says, yeah, but the community should get first, because the community is doing the work. The community was there before you decided it was interesting to invest in that thing. And the community is going to be there when you leave, when you quote unquote exit. And so, we spend a lot of time, the three of us, talking about what does that look like? What is that message to folks who have money? And, many of them want to do the right thing, but they don't have in their minds the structure that allows them to do what we're saying, because it's not familiar to them. I mean, I'm gonna give them that. It's not familiar to them, and they've been told that these are the boxes. You can do impact investing. You can do straight traditional philanthropy. You could do things like recoverable grants, where you just get your principal back. Like, there are these boxes that have been created around the capital that make the kind of conversation that we're trying to push really difficult, because people only know the boxes. But if we can focus on the goal, the impact first goal, what is it we're trying to accomplish, and what will it take? What will it take from a non-financial perspective? What types of capital can we stack to drive the agenda? That's a totally different conversation. And that's a step towards a different model and way of approaching it. And honestly, I think it's a way to help people hear what we're saying.
I was just going to add that I think this is kind of how it diverges, but it's just in communities, we have a right, especially long-term residents, folks who have lived, worked, worshiped in a neighborhood for a long time, to have some control over what happens in our community. And so I think that diverges from what we've always been taught, that it just is related to resources. We believe we're a resource and that we have some, and so that belief just has to be there in the beginning in order for us to speak up and figure this stuff out. So I think that's a little bit different. It's probably what Lisa and Adriana were already saying, but just believe in our voices, our ability to understand the dominant system really well, but to say there's an alternative and we have a right to, in fact, influence what's happening in our communities.
Awesome. Thank you. I think I just keep thinking back to this broader definition of wealth that we in Women's Way are really crazy about and always trying to socialize, that really expands like the me to we concept. And I feel like what I'm hearing a lot is just like this necessary shift to understanding what it means to, like, what return looks like, what impact looks like. I think that's really powerful and a very difficult thing to approach, our understanding our culture and understanding how to change it. So moving to the next question, I think we talked a little bit about this, like this big challenge that we seek to address on a larger scale with community wealth building. And the question here is about impact. Are there, like, what are kind of the main goals maybe for your specific organizations that you would like to see, if you could just put it into a sentence or two? And how are you kind of measuring your way to those goals?
Happy to go first again. So we measure impact across a variety of metrics, but I would say the easiest to explain for the purposes of time are control and power. And in the control space, it's really about physical control of real estate. What does the trust own and steward in the collective? What has been taken out of the speculative market? How is that real estate being utilized to advance collective benefit? So that's the high level control. Power, which is hand in hand with control, is really about policy. What policies have been advanced, or are we working on, are we in coalition with, that further collective control, collective ownership, collective wealth building? And I think oftentimes, particularly within philanthropy, the impact metrics are defined by philanthropy, right? So they say, it's really great that you're controlling the real estate. How many jobs did you create in the last year? Very important metric, right? Works at the wage gap that we're here to discuss. But the trust was built for control. And so when I have a property that has two residential units and one commercial space, the higher impact is that there's two folks that have been housed affordably, two sets of families potentially, housed affordably in this single space. One business. Based on the architecture of our spaces, that is likely going to be a mom and pop business, which means there may not be job creation, but that does not mean there is not wealth creation. And that does not mean that control and power haven't been furthered. And so really being open, I think, on our end as an organization to having conversations about impact, and that it is fluid and that it can change and evolve, and that it doesn't have to meet a definition set by them. Instead, the definition set by the folks who, as Nora mentioned, were the ones who were here before. They're the ones who are going to be here during the investment, and they're going to be the ones, oh no, it was Lisa, and they're the ones who are going to be here post-investment, right? They don't leave. This is their neighborhood. These are their stomping grounds. And so, yeah, I would say control and power for us. And most of our impact metrics fall under one of those two categories.
I can go next a little bit, but I think folks measure our impact sometimes. They're shocked that women, especially working class women, women of color, are building these buildings that are beautiful, that stand up, they're strong, that break even in terms of being financed. So people are shocked that we can do what we set out to do. On our end, we measure impact, of course, by the number of homes that we've built. We've been doing this for 38 years and we've built a little bit more than 350 homes. It's not a lot, but those homes, the rents are truly affordable to lowest income families in our community. Our 2-bedroom units are between $300 and $450 a month to rent. Well, I'm talking fast for translators, sorry. 3 bedrooms can be $400 to $550. So these are townhomes, 2 and 3 bedroom townhomes that are truly affordable in North Philly. And in fact, we've built in Point Breeze and Grace Ferry and in West Philly. So homes built, but a deeper understanding in the neighborhood of longer term affordability. What does it mean to own land as a community land trust? And to know that these homes are going to be affordable into the future. What does it mean? Whether they're rental or home ownership units. And then to us, it's also impact in the number of folks who are coming to a meeting, women building skills and telling their housing story, and also knowing the data that their sisters are in the same situation and being able to speak that to an elected official. I'm having this issue. I can't afford housing. And in fact, half of your constituents can afford their housing. And we need you to be with us as we introduce and pass this legislation. And of course, impact is getting that legislation passed and making sure that no one slimes out of it, that they stick to it and it really works.
And I'll say for us, first and foremost, it's how we support leaders like Nora and Adriana in terms of scaling the work that they're doing. And so are our supports really helping to move them and move their solutions towards scale? Are our supports beginning to help them better position around influencing policy and practices? Now, of course, they were already doing this. And we on purpose select folks who already have traction in the work. So for us, it's about, can we help you get to the next level? Whatever that next level is that you define is necessary for your leadership and your community. And then I think for us, in terms of more field facing, we're building a model and different way of funding and financing localized solutions, community-based solutions, and scale those solutions. And so we are looking at how we document the lessons we learned from this process and how we share them to other folks who want to work similarly in other communities. And I'll say finally, and this is connected to the support piece, for us, it's about leverage. Like every day we're talking about leverage. Every day we're looking actively for other funders, investors, funders of all types, let me just put it that way, and other resources that folks in our portfolio might be a fit for. And so that might seem like not a big deal, but a lot of funds don't do that. They give you your check, they say, peace, good luck. And so we feel once we have bought in, that we are responsible for helping to take folks to the next place and connect them to a network that they might not be connected to.
Awesome, thank you. And I just wanted to ask a question that had been posed in the chat to you, Lisa, to talk a little bit about what you mean by scalable. So the question here says, when you say scalable, are you also talking about replicable, i.e. bringing to other communities and expediting the process?
So what I'm talking about is helping solution leaders scale something that they're already working on and solutions they already know are effective. Okay, so this question of replicability, we could have a whole session around the difference between scale and replication. What we don't do in our work and relationship with folks in our portfolio is define what scale means for them and for their communities. They define scale. And so some folks define scale as in we are reaching more people. Some folks define scale as, you know, I really would like to share my model with more folks. And some people define scale as I want to sort of go deeper, more vertical with respect to the work that I'm doing. We don't define that. What we do is say, what are you trying to do? How are you defining scale? What are the resources, financial and non-financial, needed to get there? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what we do.
It's really helpful. And yeah, I think it reveals just how participatory this kind of funding works, and like investing, to use that word, works. I'm also seeing quite a few questions around funding. You've mentioned a little bit that there needs to be a shift in how funders and philanthropy at large approach this kind of work. So I would love to hear more about where you think the state of funding is now, and kind of what's needed.
I can kick us off on that. I have a lot to say about that.
Go off.
I'm not happy with it, but I'm going to first start in a happy place with this, because I think in terms of the perspectives and the mindsets necessary, let me slow myself down, because when I get excited, I talk fast. There are different perspectives and mindsets necessary to fund and invest in this kind of work. First, it might sound corny, but you need some hope. Like, if you don't have hope, I don't know how you get up, but you have to have hope. The second thing is you have to respect and bet on the knowledge and initiative of local leaders. And that sounds like that doesn't sound like a big deal, but I will say that nationally, it's very hard for local leaders to get in the aperture, you know, and they're head down doing their work, while a lot of energy is being spent trying to find a big, splashy national initiative, which in some cases we absolutely need. And we need local folks funded to do what it is they're doing, so they can do it better, and they can do it more, and they can do it in a more impactful way. And the last thing I'll say about this is it also requires, in terms of mindset shift, it's like really flipping the notion of risk. When everyone is entering these conversations from the point of view of scarcity, the communities and the local leaders are entering the conversation from scarcity because they don't have enough to do what they're doing or want to do. And believe it or not, the wealthy purse holders are also entering the conversation with scarcity, because they're thinking, well, my funds got to last a really long time. Some of the folks who are running these funds now were not the people who made the money. Like, this is the generation that inherited the wealth. They don't know how to make, okay, but I'm just going to say it. They don't know how to make the money the way their ancestors did. So they really are thinking, well, I have to conserve money. So when everyone's entering a conversation about solutions and change from a scarcity perspective, it's very hard to have an imagination. You can't have an imagination if you're thinking from scarcity. So we don't talk about risk. We talk about assets that local folks and leaders are bringing to the table. We get that gaps exist, but we have to start from an asset framing perspective, so that we can then see what we're building on and have honest conversations about, and then what are the other rungs of the ladder that we need to address for us to really move the work to scale. But first, we have to be honest and say, We're not taking the risk. The people who are doing the work are taking the risk because they live in the community. We're putting money on the table to facilitate work. That's what we're doing. Like, let's not make this complicated. And it's an important ingredient, but it really takes a very different perspective and mindset. And so I spend a lot of time in conversations with impact investors and philanthropists and forums like similar to this, saying these same things over and over. I don't think what I've said is magical, but what I do know is that we have the power. People have more power than they think to change the way they're practicing. And until then, we're just going to keep practicing the way we're practicing and showing people it is possible. It's absolutely possible.
Thank you for.
I have something to say, but I can wait until you talk. Adriana, do you want to go next? So on our end, I was looking at all the questions, and there's lots of questions, and I'm glad to talk to anyone after this session about how we financed housing and how we've taken money that has been hard to use or expensive and figured out how to use it through CDFIs and others. But a big problem for us is that land used to be really affordable in Philadelphia because there were not many market rate developers that wanted to come in, richer, whiter folks that wanted to come into Philly, and that has shifted. And so Lisa mentioned it, but my organization, along with someone who's part of this webinar, we started this loan fund. We did not know what we were doing. We just thought that there were people out there that might be interested in lending to us.
Nora,
and so
just try and slow it down just a little bit.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'll say it really slowly. We did not know what we were doing. And we came together and talked to folks who came from some resources to see if they wanted to invest in our idea of buying land, because market rate developers have deep pockets and our pockets had holes in them, or we didn't have pockets in our pants. So we were able, so Stacy Moore, who's on this call, who's the chair of the board of the Women's Community Revitalization Project, and I did a presentation to some folks from Resource Generation, which are families, people who come from families of wealth. They happen to be part of our coalition that we staff. And that night we raised $250,000. And thus far we've raised $2 million. A piece of that is from Community Impact Investment, Lisa's fund. But we've also found that there are foundations now that are willing to take some risks, be hopeful with us, and invest and understand that it's going to take a while to do this work, that we need low interest to no interest, very low interest, but that the return for them can be on multiple levels. So I guess I just wanted to say about the loan fund. I'll stop there. Anyone wants to invest in the loan fund, talk to me.
I just wanted to add that scarcity and risk, I think, are so important because they are at the table. They show up almost before we sit down. And I personally do not operate from a scarcity mindset because the 1%ers own 80% of all of our commercial buildings in the United States. There's no scarcity there. The other thing is risk defined by whom? And this is a question that we talk about all the time. I am not interested in your traditional capital risk. I am interested in the risk to the people who live in Kensington and do business in Kensington when we do not do the work that is necessary of turning the tide of disinvestment that has happened in a predominantly Black and brown low-income neighborhood for decades through policy and otherwise. And so just a reminder that when people say risk, they oftentimes inherently mean financial risk. When I say risk, I'm saying there are people who are being actively displaced. There are people who cannot afford their rent. There are people who cannot move out of poverty. That's a risk to all of us, not just to those households, not just to the women who are running those households, to all of us. And I think if we are not having that conversation, we're spending time in the wrong rooms with the wrong people because they probably are stuck in a risk and scarcity mindset that is aligned with traditional capital. And I just don't have time for it because, like Nora, I'm also raising I can't. I can't spend time in those rooms. I have to be in the spaces where people see that the real risk is the risk of not investing.
Thank you. I want to move along because I wish we had a longer time to just keep talking. There's so many questions that I have for you all, but for the sake of time, I want to shift to one last question, and then maybe we'll open it up to some of the Q&A. But kind of on this vein, Adriana, that you kind of closed up on, that how do community wealth building models, how does the work that both you and Nora are doing in your communities impact gender equity?
Absolutely. On so many levels. So for us specifically, I would say that the two lowest hanging fruit are business creation and support and development. At least half of our business owners that we've attracted to the corridor are women of color who are low, moderate income people running households. And they had the audacity to believe in themselves and invest in themselves. And KCT, Kensington Corridor Trust, we are so excited to be able to support them in their journey on the corridor, in their neighborhoods, right? These are also women who Kensington is home, right? So they're doing business at home. That's one way. I think the second way for us that we really like to prioritize is the ability to access upward mobility. Because folks have access to a lower rent, they have more financial spaciousness and time spaciousness and reduced stress that allows them to focus on other aspects of their life, like perhaps getting more education or working towards that job promotion that has a higher pay scale, or potentially changing employment entirely, right? There are so many opportunities that open up when someone just has room to breathe, because their rent is not their biggest burden. It is not the largest cost that they have to worry about. And so those are the two, from the perspective of the community wealth building work we're doing at the neighborhood trust model, that I think are so easily described and I think so easily felt. We see it every day. We get to walk by it every day on our corridor.
Yeah, I agree. So we keep data on folks who are in homes that WCRP has built. And in 4 years, people's incomes generally, even in COVID, have gone up more than 50%. So it's, once you have an affordable place to live, you can do so many other things with that. But I think there's also something around influencing policy that affects us as women, having a seat around the table, getting involved in first being angry. There was a question about how do you move from the I to the we. People are angry. And I think with hope, that anger can turn into really a strong voice. You may already have a strong voice, make it stronger, but having a seat around the table to know you have a right to influence our elected officials, or make them a little bit afraid of you and respect you because of our people power, sister power together. And having those seats around the table, we've changed the city charter to ensure that every mayor has to put 0.5% of our general fund dollars into affordable housing. I mean, that kind of work makes a huge difference for us, for our daughters, for our sisters. All of that work is important.
Awesome, thank you. I want to open it up to some Q&A. I see some here that I can read, and if you have additional questions, feel free to add them into the Q&A. So a couple questions that I saw were around CDFIs when we're talking about funding. So these are community development financial institutions. So some people were asking, like, in the role of funding the work that you all do in your neighborhoods, where do CDFIs come into play?
I can go first. So CDFIs are not all alike. Some are more risk averse than others. Some are very progressive in CDFIs for the work that the Women's Community Revitalization Project does in terms of real estate development. May take some risks around pre-development lending. Very rarely are they risks that are as long as we would like. We'd love their loans to have a longer term, but we really see them as allies. Sometimes they belong to a system called the Federal Home Loan Bank, and they can partner with us, and we have access to grant resources, equity that is really important. So I've seen CDFIs also be our partners and step out around policy issues because they understand that it's important for their constituents.
And I'll add that, like Nora said, there are a swath of different types of CDFIs, each of which functions differently, has different programs. What we've been really fortunate to do is to partner with ones that are on the ground in Kensington. So we work with Green Line Access Capital, which is based right in Kensington, founded by someone who was at Finanta, because I saw that in the chat. They're an amazing technical assistance partner to the small businesses in the neighborhood. We had the ability to work with the Impact Loan Fund to do some gap financing so we could make a rapid acquisition because the market was moving and I did not yet have the capital teed up. And so it was great short-term lending. And then we have national ones that have a Philadelphia footprint, like the Nonprofit Finance Fund, that was able to use pass-through dollars from CARES to do 0% lending to us for a project. And so really just staying in touch with the CDFI networks, because they are partners in this work, not just in the financial side, but as Nora mentioned, also on the policy side, right? What benefits us benefits them, what benefits them benefits us.
Great. I think I'm always shocked to learn just how many CDFIs there are in the area. It's really, really awesome. And even to know that there are some right there in your community, in your neighborhood, it just really just like ties everything together. This is truly a local thing. Like when it's micro local, it just works. And there's a question here about of buying way about home ownership. Someone who's interested in owning their own home, but being able to generate the wealth that's necessary to buy one. So the question is there a way to create affordable land and houses? Grant programs that help with down payment assistance just isn't enough.
So I can just give a case of what we have done. So we do mostly deeply affordable rental housing. We've done some lease purchase, but
Nora,
we did
just a little bit
slow
slower.
down. We have done mostly deeply affordable rental housing, but we have also done some lease purchase and some direct home ownership. And the way we were able to do the direct home ownership development, it cost us $300,000 to build a house in Point Breeze. We raised grant financing for $150,000, and so we sold it for $150,000. It's part of the community land trust, so it needs the next, if the owner decides to ever sell, they can leave it to their heirs, but if they decide to ever sell, then they need to sell to a family that is income eligible. And there are rules, but it's not that hard. So is that a good enough example?
Yeah, I wonder for those who are interested in becoming a homeowner by purchasing land through a community land trust or a property owned by a community land trust, if there are ways to keep an eye out, or just like keep learning about it so that if an opportunity arises, is there a way to do that?
Are you asking me how do you find out about community land trusts that are doing home ownership?
Yeah, for someone who's interested in buying a home.
So there are going to be some resources after this. People can get in touch with me. One group in the neighborhood where Adriana and I have worked is ASE, that's doing home ownership. There are a number of them that are starting to do this work.
Awesome. Okay. So we will be sending out a community resource guide and a recording of this event. So there will be, as Nora said, lots of links for you to follow up on based on things that the panelists have mentioned today. Okay, let me see what other questions we have here. So another question that we have is talking about, so we talked a lot about the me to we kind of mindset shift, thinking about what risk really is, what's really at stake for funders. But there's a question here about doing that mind shift change or getting neighbors in the communities that you work in to sign on to this. So the question is, how do you get skeptics within the community, but also deeply affected by the wealth gap raised within this capitalist system to shift from me to we?
I'm happy to tackle first. So I will say that I think it very much depends on person by person, neighborhood by neighborhood. In Kensington specifically, because the neighborhood has been so deeply impacted by systemic challenges, disinvestment, public health crises, you name it, we can keep going down a rattled list. This neighborhood was already organized. And so when I had the privilege of stepping into this role, I was stepping into a neighborhood that already knew what they wanted, how they wanted to get it, and how they were going to get there. And so my role, as I've seen it in the role of our lead community organizer, has been to really just harness that and work with folks to make sure that their power that is collective is in the right rooms and at the right spaces and tables. That's not to say that because you are in collective, you are not still worried about your individual household, because that's a lived reality, right? When we are in a collective meeting and we're in a coalition space, we are absolutely in conversation about we. It is a we conversation. What are we going to do? What is the solution that we can advance? But when you go home and you have food insecurity, or you have challenges with employment, or you're in poor living conditions, you are still in I and me, and as you should be, right? You have to worry about yourself to be able to worry for others. You have to care for yourself in order to care for others. You can't pour from a cup that's half empty. And so, really in finding the way to not only focus on the collective and the policy and the power, but to also work on wellness and health and job creation, which I, spoke a little bit to earlier, which is not a thing that I think the Kensington Quarter Trust directly does, but there are things that other folks in the neighborhood are doing, right, through workforce development and training that we can tap into. So knowing where the resources are, so that when someone comes in with a very individualized challenge, and then the other thing worth noting is that many individualized challenges are systems challenges that are felt by many of the people in the room, which is why we are in collective to begin with, right? And so it all kind of just folds and blurs together, and I think it makes for something really beautiful, right? It's this beautiful combination of people's power and people's vision, and then how to get there, that allows us to do this work. But it definitely doesn't come without challenge. But I think each neighborhood has to start with a base. What is it that we all want that benefits all or the most of us? And working from there as a starting point.
Great, thank you so much. So I think I wish we had more time, but I am going to follow up with the panelists and make sure that we gather all this information and get it to you all so that you can keep reading, keep learning, and thinking about community wealth building in Philly. And so I want to thank the panelists so much for being here with us today. And I'll hand it off to Kelly to close us out. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And we want to thank each and every one of you for your attendance, participation, and engagement in this conversation. And a special thank you to our panelists and our moderator. This series is ongoing, so we'll continue to explore closing the gender wealth gap in our series with dates and topics, hopefully shared soon. Diane will put the slides up. Great. We're excited to move into a solution space. So for those of you wondering, what can I do? Where can I find hope? Join us to learn more about how our communities are reimagining a more just economy. We also want to continue the conversation about wealth inequality and engage more with you, our partners, and community. Finally, please take the survey, which is in the chat, and let us know what worked for you and what you'd like to see. Check out our social media and website for more announcements on events and programming. We can't wait to see you, and thanks for joining.
Thanks all.